Today we're going to be factoring with greatest common factor and factoring by grouping. So let's talk about greatest common factor first. The term greatest means the most or the highest. Common means something that they share in common together. And factors are what multiplies to get you to a certain variable or number. So we have an example here. If someone named Tay has $25, Byron has $30, and Tanner has $15. We want to borrow the same amount of money from each person. So how much can you take from each person? So let's think about this. Between 25, 30, and 15, the greatest amount we can borrow from each person would be what the lowest amount is. And so our greatest common factor here would be 15. So now let's apply that to algebra. How many x's can we take when we have x to the 5th, x to the 8th, and x to the 15th? Well, they all have in common an x to the 5th. We couldn't take an x to the 8th or the x to the 15th because that would be negatives for x to the 5th and x to the 8th. So our greatest common factor for this one would be x to the 5th. So now we're going to apply that to a polynomial here. Polynomial just means one or more terms. Here we have two terms. So we want to look at what the greatest common factor, or GCF, is between these two terms. And so you want to take it piece by piece. First, you want to look at the numbers. We have the numbers 4 and 12. The greatest common factor between 4 and 12 would be a 4. The greatest common factor now between q to the 4th and q would be a q. And so we're going to divide out a 4q. We're going to divide each of those terms by 4q and write what we have left inside of these parentheses. So now let's take it piece by piece again. 4 divided by 4 would give us 1. Q to the 4th divided by q would give us q to the 3rd. Plus, now we have 12q divided by 4q. So 12 divided by 4 would give us 3. And q divided by q would cancel, and so we are left with 4q parenthesis q to the 3rd plus 3. Factoring out by greatest common factor is the opposite of distributing. We should end up with a term on the outside and then terms on the inside of our parentheses. Okay, so let's look at example 2. We have 5xy minus 4y. So again, we're going to take it piece by piece, and the greatest common factor between 5 and 4 would just be a 1. 5 and 4 are not divisible by the same numbers. X, well, we don't have an x in this term, so we can't take that. But we do have a y in both terms. So our greatest common factor here would be a 1y. And then parenthesis, we're going to divide each term by that y and write what's remaining inside of the parentheses. So 5 divided by 1 is going to give us a 5. X is not being divided, so we have an x inside of the parentheses. And then y divided by y would just be 1 again, so we're left with 5x minus 4 divided by 1 is going to give us 4. And y divided by y would cancel, and so we're left with 1y as our greatest common factor times 5x minus 4. So that's factoring by the greatest common factor. So I'm going to let you go ahead and pause the video and try these two as examples. And I will put the greatest common factor on the screen here for you. So go ahead and hit pause and practice these two. Okay, and you can see on the screen here, Your greatest common factor from example A was 3x, and when you divide out a 3x, you get 3x parenthesis 1 minus 3x. Example B, our greatest common factor was 6t squared, and so when we divide that out, we get 6t squared parentheses 4t plus 1. So that's greatest common factor. I will post the worked out examples of all these slides in the agenda page for Unit 5. And so you can go through and try all of these examples and check the answer key for those. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to what is called factoring by grouping. Now, greatest common factor you can use to factor any polynomial. Factoring by grouping works when there are 4 terms. And so we are going to look, here's an example. We have 2x to the third minus 8x squared plus 3x minus 12. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. What you want to do is you want to group the first term together. That's this underline here. First 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. And we want to factor out the greatest common factor from each group. So from this group here, our first group, our greatest common factor would be 2x squared. And so we want to factor out a 2x squared. 2x squared. That goes on the outside of our parentheses. And then when we divide that by 2x squared, we're going to end up with x minus 4 inside our parentheses. X minus 4. Now we're going to go ahead and divide our second group here. The greatest common factor between 3x and negative 12 would be a 3. And so we're going to divide out a 3 as our greatest common factor. And when we divide both of those terms by 3, 3x divided by 3 would give us x. Negative 12 divided by 3 would give us 4. And we are going to end up with 3x minus 4 again. Now this should happen when you're factoring by grouping, that both sets of your parentheses should come out to be exactly the same. In this case, they are x minus 4. So x minus 4 becomes one of our factors that we write in parentheses. And what becomes our other factor is what's remaining outside of the parentheses. So we have 2x squared and plus 3. That becomes our second factor here in these parentheses. So 2x squared plus 3. And now we have fully factored this 4-term polynomial by grouping the first 2 terms together, the second 2 terms together, taking out the greatest common factor of each group and dividing each term by that. Then our 2 parentheses match, and that becomes one of our factors. What's left on the outside becomes our other factor. So go ahead and pause this video. Try these examples, and I'm going to go ahead and put the answer key here on the screen for example A. And then I want you to check the completed answers or completed notes for the answers to the remaining problems. So here you can see the factored from the first group, greatest common factor of x squared, parenthesis x minus 1. Next group has a greatest common factor of negative 8. and we divide that out, we get x minus 1 again inside our parentheses. Now our two sets of parentheses match. And so that becomes one of our factors as x minus 1. And then our other factor is what's remaining outside, which would be x squared minus 8. And we successfully factored this 4-term polynomial by grouping. Let's go ahead and check the completed notes for the answers to the other examples. And that is factoring by greatest common factor and factoring by grouping. We want to group when there are 4 terms. And we want to use greatest common factor anytime there's anything in common among all the terms.